Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and today, Mirz Hashem, we will be learning Daf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, beginning and completing Siman Reish Nun Hey, a bit of a departure from the material that we've been covering until now. This is a much far simpler Siman than what we've had until now. It's interesting because some people look at this Siman and they feel that it's not very much Negea Halacha L'Maisa. But first of all, you should know everything is Negea Halacha L'Maisa, because even if it's not Negea Halacha L'Maisa to you right now, you don't know how situations change. You don't know what situation you find yourself in. So in that way, everything could be Negea Halacha L'Maisa. But there's another reason why everything is Negea Halacha L'Maisa, and that is you never know what nuance you learn in halacha from something that does not seem to be so negea halacha l'maisa, but you need the limud of that nuance to something else that does take place in your life, where you do need that yediyah or that concept for something that's very much negea halacha l'maisa. This particular siman happens to be negea halacha l'maisa for people who live in different places, and we'll see that as we go. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanesunim Batzaro Bashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayom Ubein Bayabasha Hamalka Yirachem Aleihem V'Yitziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelu La'Oira Mishibud L'Geula Hashta Bagala Uzman Kariv Neymar Amen. Our learning should be a schus refuah shalema for David Ben Blima. He should have a refuah shalema b'Soich Shar Chole Yisrael. I'm recording this share on Yom Rishon of Parshas Ve'eschanan, 2 days before Tisha B'Av, and just in the context of Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, I was on the phone with a relative this morning who lives in Eretz Yisrael, and I asked him how he's doing. I asked him what the feeling over there is, and he said it feels like a potato that's inside the food processor, and the lady has her finger poised over the switch to turn on the food processor, and you don't know, is she going to turn on the switch? Is she not going to turn on the switch? Is the blade start spinning? Is the blade not going to start spinning? That's the way they feel right now. They have missiles and bombs pointed at them from all over, and the question is anybody going to pull the plug? Of course, it's not up to them. Hakol bidei shamayim, but we have to be mispal to the Rebbeinu Shalom, the Rebbeinu Shalom, Shomer Yisrael, Hine Lagan V'Lo Yishon Shomer Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should protect against Klal Yisrael. Okay, so let's begin here. Chav Zayin Amud Aleph Siman Reish Nun Hey Hachanas Ha'esh Kaidem Hachnasas Shabbos. How you are to prepare a fire before Shabbos begins. Uboy Gimel Seifim, and here we have 3 Seifim. Fire was a very important item on Shabbos. You needed a fire to light, to keep the house well lit. You needed a fire to keep the house heated. You needed a fire to keep the cholent warm. So fire was a very important facet of preparations for Shabbos. We've learned Reish Nun Gimel, we've learned Reish Nun Dalid, so we learned all about Shehiyah and Chazara, how we deal with the fire in the kira, in the tanur, in regards to food preparation. Now we switch to just in general, having a fire for lighting purposes, having a fire for heating purposes. Let's see what the Mechaber says, Reish Nun Hey Sif Aleph. Ein oisin madura, you're not allowed to make a madura. A madura, the only English word that I could think of for a madura, is a bonfire. So it's a significant fire, typically made out of a bunch of logs, a stack of wood, but the connotation of madura is that this fire is not contained in anything. This is not a fire that's contained inside a tanur or inside a kira. It's more of an exposed fire. So einois in madura, you're not allowed to make this madura, me eitzim, out of pieces of wood, samach l'chashecha, very close to the onset of Shabbos, ad sheyatzis bahen ha'ur, until it has to have enough time before Shabbos that the fire should take hold. Be'inyan, in such a manner, shetehea shal heves oila me'eleha, so that the fire will grow and continue on its own, belisi yua eitzim acherim, without it needing the help of any additional kindling. So if anybody ever went to build a bonfire for camp, or to build a fire in a fireplace, or to build a fire in a in a wood-burning stove that's used to heat a house. Building a fire is not always the simplest thing in the world. You have these nice, big, beautiful pieces of firewood. You stack them up. You try to light them. They don't readily ignite. You need kindling. So you need thin strips of wood. Out in the wild, you would use, dry twigs, dry leaves. In a fireplace, you usually use little pieces of fat wood or thin pieces of wood, and you ignite those. Those catch well, and they burn nicely. And then you add some bigger wood until you can finally add your logs. And then the logs take hold. So what the Mechaber is telling us over here is, you're not allowed to build a fire right before Shabbos unless you give it enough time before Shabbos that the fire will take hold to the extent that it no longer needs any additional work. It's not going to require you to go ahead and add any further kindling. And what's the reason for this? Well, we can understand right away. We've dealt in Reish Dun Gimel, in Reish Dun Daled, over and over again with the Gzeira Shemi Echata B'Gechalim. We were afraid that you have a fire that you're using for cooking purposes. We have to look at the food. How well done does the food have to be before Shabbos, so that there should not be a fear that you're going to stoke the coals to accelerate the cooking process. Over here, our fear is a little bit of a different fear. You're building a fire right before Shabbos. We're afraid that if the fire has not taken hold well, then there's a gzeira, there's a fear, you might come to add kindling on Shabbos. You might come to move around the wood on Shabbos, but you might come to do an act of Havara. You might come to be over on the Malacha Daraisa of Havara. So what do we want? We want that you build the fire before Shabbos with enough time until the fire took hold and it's growing on its own. It does not need any additional help. Now, how about if you're only burning one solitary log? You're not burning a stack of wood, so we don't have to be afraid that you're going to move around the pieces of wood so that the air could get in or anything else. You're burning one single solitary piece of wood. What's this year? If you're burning one log, so then you have to have enough time before Shabbos that the fire takes hold of roiv avyoy. Avyoy is the thickness of the wood. The Mishnah Berurah is going to say that you have to see that the fire is already inside the log. It's not just burning on the surface of the log. The fire has penetrated to the inside of the log. I guess if you build fires regularly, you would understand this and you would know exactly what it needs. What it means. Asamaratzim that deal, with natural gas flames and this and that. We don't build fires all that often. I have a fireplace. I do build fires in my fireplace. In my mind, I have a picture of what this means when you see the fire emanating of the heart of the wood. That's roiv avyoy, uber roiv hekefai. The fire also has to have taken hold in the majority of the circumference of the log, not just that you see fire coming out of one side of the log. It has to be coming out of roiv hekefai, most of the circumference of the log. So that's how much time you need before Shabbos. You have to build the fire substantially before Shabbos comes in, so that there's no fear that you're going to do something to accelerate the kindling. You're going to add wood, you're going to move the pieces of wood around. We have to know that the fire has taken hold, and now you're done, and there's no room for a gezerah. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Aleph, Ein Oisin Madura. Now, we've spoken about so far a Madura, which I told you was like an open fire. Says the Chavetz Chaim, V'hu adinim roitza lahasik oz hatanur shel beis hachoref. How about if you're building a fire inside the wood-burning stove for the Beis HaChoref? That was that winter room, maybe a nice insulated room with a wood-burning stove. So now you're not building an exposed fire, you're building a fire inside a wood-burning stove. Now, to understand this Mishnah Berurah properly, it seems that the way they built fires was they took wood, they loaded the wood inside the wood-burning stove, they ignited the pile of wood. Now, the nature of burning wood, we know that one of the things wood needs to burn, any fire needs to burn, is air. So now, if you would take the wood and you would put in a fire and ignite it, and then close all the doors and close the dampers, the fire is going to go out. It needs air. So what they used to do was they used to build the fire inside the stove and keep the door cracked open so that the stove could get plenty of air inside and it could burn well. And what they would do is they would build a nice big fire, and they would want the fire to burn so that it really burns up the wood. Now, when I say it burns up the wood, I don't mean that it consumes everything, but it burns up the wood, and then the fire would go out, and you would have burning embers. You would have like glowing coals. Then they would pretty much close the door, and now it's the residual heat of the embers that would warm the house. They didn't want a big fire going because big fires were smoky, and they didn't want to have a lot of smoke coming into the house. They also didn't want to have the door open to feed a big fire because, again, if the door is open, it's going to burn out very quickly. So this was how they managed their fires. Based on this, says the Mishnah Berurah as follows. The Mechaber was talking about a Madura, an open fire. Says the Chavetz Chaim, "V'hu adinim roitza lahasikas atanu shel beis hachorev nami dinoi kimedura." If we want to apply this halacha of the Mechaber to the fire inside a wood-burning stove, it applies the same way. Eli imken ataner tuach petit da'oz shari. So what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is, the same way by the Madura, the fire has to have taken hold well into the stack of wood so that you don't need further kindling. The same gzera applies to a fire inside a tanur, to the fire inside the wood-burning stove. The fire has to have taken hold so that it doesn't need any additional kindling before Shabbos. Now the Chavetz Chaim is medayik a little bit here. Says the Chavetz Chaim, mashma, the implication is, the implication of the Mechaber is, okay, you need enough time for the fire to take hold so that it's growing on its own and it doesn't need any additional help. If it's lit to that point before Shabbos, shaper dummy, it should be mutter, af b'tanur she'enoi tuach petit, even in a tanur that's not tuach petit. I missed one point here. What the Chavetz Chaim said was, this halacha applies equally to a fire inside a tanur unless the door to the tanur is closed and it's sealed with clay. If the door to the tanur is closed and it's sealed with clay, we're not chayshish, you're going to bust it open and go work the fire. Now says the Mishnah Berurah, okay, so the implication is, if the door to the oven is not closed and sealed with clay, so long as the fire has taken hold enough that it's growing on its own, you're allowed, now you're good. It took hold to that extent before Shabbos, now it's good. Says the Chavetz Chaim, not so fast, to become Mokaim. Nevertheless, nearly, it would seem to me, says the Chavetz Chaim, that lechatchila, you should take care not to make a fire very close to Shabbos, af ba'ofen zeh, even under these circumstances where you made the fire in the tanur and it is oila shaleves me'aleha before Shabbos, or rather, yireh, you should see to it sheyiheh af gemar hehesik b'choil. What the Chavetz Chaim is saying is, really, if you're making a fire inside a wood-burning stove, you should make the fire and you should have the whole fire burn up and burn out so that now you have the glowing embers. That whole process should be completed before Shabbos. Why? Because the Chavetz Chaim says it's like this. If you're going to build the fire very close to Shabbos, even if the shalheves is oila me'aleha before Shabbos starts, you're not happy with that. You want the fire to burn up until it gets to the point where all you have is glowing embers. And even if the fire is oila me'aleha before Shabbos, you're still going to have burning pieces of wood. And if you have burning pieces of wood, says the Chavetz Chaim, you're going to end up calling in an Eina Yehudi to go extinguish those burning pieces of wood. Why? Because what's going to happen is, if you still have burning pieces of wood, you're going to have to leave the door open. Because if you close the door when you still have burning pieces of wood, you're going to end up with a very smoky fire. So you're going to end up leaving the door open. If you leave the door open, the fire is going to cool down quickly. So says the Chavetz Chaim like this, it's true. the Mechaber says that the fire has to be lit before Shabbos. Ad shalheves oila me'aleha. Says the Chavetz Chaim, even though it would seem that the halacha applies equally to the Tanner Beis HaChayrith, the Chavetz Chaim says lechatchila, since the way they did things was that they wanted the fire to burn down until you had glowing embers, and then close the door. Says the Chavetz Chaim, you really want to get to that extent before Shabbos. Because if you don't get to that extent before Shabbos, then you're going to run to the Rav and you're going to ask the Rav for a heter to call an Ein Yehudi into the house to extinguish the pieces of firewood that are still actively burning, that are still in flame. Don't bring yourself to this Amira La'akum unnecessarily. Now you'll ask me, what's the big deal? Says the Chavetz Chaim. In cold climates, we allow you lechatchila, we learned this already previously, to ask an Ein Yehudi to build a fire for you on Shabbos to heat your house. Remember, we said a kol chayli eitzel tzina. Everybody is considered an ill person when it comes to cold weather, because it was very matzui to get sick from the cold. And Amir La'akum is a shvus. Shvus b'makam chayli is mutter. So in a very cold climate, if you need a fire Shabbos afternoon to keep the house warm, lechatchila, you're allowed to go do Amir La'akum and ask an akum to go build a fire for you. So says the Chavetz Chaim, I'm telling you that you should be machmir on Erev Shabbos, that your fire should already be to the point of glowing embers before Shabbos, lest you need to do Amir La'akum to have him put out some of the actively burning sticks. What's the big deal? I already told you that to ask an Ein Yehudi to actually build a fire for you on Shabbos is mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it's not the same. Tahasam ein lo yetza acheres. Over there where we're matter to have an Ein Yehudi build a fire for you, that's because there is no other eitzah. Damasha Hisik Esmol, because you might have built a fire for your house on Erev Shabbos, but Kfar Niskarer, by Shabbos afternoon, 12 o'clock, that fire is already burnt out. Now your house is freezing. So you need to call in an Ein Yehudi to build you a fire. But in the case that's under discussion over here, where we're talking about building a fire on Erev Shabbos, Harei Yochel Hasik Mikaidim. Make it your business to build the fire earlier and complete the process of putting out the active flames before Shabbos. Not that you should have to wait for not to go call an Ein Yehudi to do it for you on Shabbos, unless there would be a big oinus. I remember speaking to somebody in Hilchos Shabbos many years ago. We were discussing the Shaila. We'll get to this later on Hilchos Shabbos. Is it mutter to take a big ice chopper and chop ice on Erev Shabbos? Your sidewalk is all icy. Could you take the chopper and chop ice on Erev Shabbos? And the contemporary poskim had very, very different opinions on this. But I remember hearing the Debretzina Rav, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, said that it should be done before Shabbos. Don't wait to do it on Shabbos, do it before Shabbos. So somebody asked him, but what if you didn't do it before Shabbos? And he got upset. He said, if you didn't do it before Shabbos, you're a pesheya. You should have done it before Shabbos. You had an eitzah to do it before Shabbos. You should have done it before Shabbos. I don't want to hear about it anymore. He was very tough on it. He said, come on. If there's something that you could do before Shabbos to get out of the Shiloh, do it before Shabbos to get out of the Shiloh. Ois cotton base. So the Mechaber said that the fire has to be lit on Shabbos ad sheyatzis, until the fire takes hold very well. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, because if the fire didn't take hold well, so then we're afraid. You're going to go stoke it, you're going to move around the wood so that it should catch. When you build a fire, sometimes you have to separate the big pieces of wood so that air could get in, but there's a process of building a fire, and all of this would entail being over the Issa Daraisa of Havara. So we're afraid you're going to do this, Mishatach Shach. That's why the fire has to be well built, and it has to be burning well before Shabbos. Ois Cotton Gimel, the words of the Mechaber were that it has to be, the Shalheves has to be Yoitze Me'aleha Beli Siyua, without any help. What does that mean, Beli Siyua? The words of the Mechaber were Beli Siyua Eitzim Acherim, without the help of any additional wood. He explains to Mishnah Berurah, what he means is Tahainu Shelo Yehi Tzarech Loimar, so that you shouldn't have to say Havei Eitzim Dakim, bring more thin pieces of kindling, V'naniach Tachtein, and let's put it under the logs kedei lahavir, so that it should burn well. Ois cotton dalit. We said that if you're dealing not with a fire built out of many different logs, if you're dealing with a one-piece fire, one log, so then the shear is that the fire has to have taken hold beroiv of yai throughout most of the thickness of the wood. Explains to Mishnah Berurah, this means sheyikonis ha'urim mibifnim. It means that the fire has already penetrated to the interior of the log, besoich of yai, into the thickness of the log, ad rubai, until it's penetrated most of the log. V'gam sheyispashet beroiv hakefai mibachutz, and it also has to be burning on most of the circumference, most of the surface of the wood. Now we go weiter in the Mechaber, in the third line down in Siman Reish Nun Hey. Says the Mechaber, V'maloi hudlika kolkach. What if your fire was not lit to this degree before Shabbos began? So you lit the fire before Shabbos began, and it was not Oila shall heves me'eleha. It was iffy, and you might have to say, bring some more kindling. Or if it was a one-piece fire, it wasn't Roiv Hakefa, and it wasn't Roiv Avyai. Says the Mechaber, in that case, Aser lehanais by b'Shabbos, you are not allowed to be nene from that fire on Shabbos. You are over on an Issa D'Rabbanan. So even if after Shabbos begins, the fire manages to jump up and it manages to take hold well, and now you do have a good fire, so now there is no room anymore for Gzeira Shemi Echote. So in other words, you lit the fire right before Shabbos. Was it Oila Me'eleha B'loi Siyua Eitzim Acherim before Shabbos? No. You looked at it, you were like, oh boy, I hope this fire is going to catch. It's a very small fire. So you were over on the Yisad Rabbanon. Then you had Siyata D'Shmaya. I don't know if you want to call it Siyata D'Shmaya, whatever. Now the fire managed to go take hold very well. So you're like, oh, now I'm sitting pretty. Baruch Hashem, it worked out. No. You were over on an Issa D'Rabbanan. Shabbos. You're not allowed to get hana from this fire on Shabbos, and this is because of the Gzeira Shebi Echataba V'Yanida Eitzim Kadesha Tala Ashaleves. Because of this Gzeira. You were over on this Gzeira. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Hey, you're not allowed to get hana. Pirish explains to Chavetz Chaim, this means Afilu Hudlika Achakach Legamri. Even if, like I said, you got lucky. The fire took hold, and now it's burning a beautiful fire. You're not allowed to have hana from that fire. Why? Because you were over on the Yisud Rabbanon. Says the Chavetz Chaim, U'kamaysha kasa b'sayk Siman Reish Nun Dalet Sivches. We saw this very clearly in the previous year in Reish Nun Dalet Sivches, Ba'asosiyos v'termusin, where we spoke about the case. We said there's an Yisud Rabbanon, the Yisur of Shehiyah. You're not allowed to put raw legumes into the pot right before Shabbos. Even though we say by meat, there's a special heter. If you have raw meat, you could put it up in a pot right before Shabbos on the Kira, because there's no Gzeira Shemi Echata B'Gecholim, because you Mesiach Das, you know the meat's not going to be ready for the Shabbos night Suda. But beans, we said legumes, they can get cooked very, very quickly. You're not going to be Mesiach Das. So by these legumes, by these asosios and termusin, you're not allowed to put them up in a Kira right before Shabbos, even if they're raw. And what did we say? The Mechaber said, if you did do it, then guess what? Those legumes are aser bana. You're not allowed to eat them until Motzei Shabbos b'chdei sheyas b'yeyaseh. So too over here. You were over on the Issa D'Rabbanan. You did not make the fire early enough on Erev Shabbos. It was not the shear of Oila shal heves me'aleh b'li siyua eitzim acherim. Now it caught hold. You're not allowed to have enough from it. The kol she'avar al divrei Chazal, because anytime you're over on an Issa D'Rabbanan, asel hanois, you're not allowed to have hana from that ad Motzei Shabbos until Motzei Shabbos. Says the Mechaber weiter, 4 lines into Siman Reish Nun Hey, right by the Mishnah Berurah, right by the Vav for the Mishnah Berurah. Ukishahudlika kashir. But let's say you did it right. Ukishahudlika bashir. If you lit the fire and you ignited it very well, properly before Shabbos, so it was already Oila shall heves me'eleha before Shabbos began. Then says the Mechaber, Yachal hischamem kenegda b'Shabbos. You could go and sit next to the fire and get nice and toasty warm on Shabbos. Ulehishtamesh la'oira. You could use the light of the fire, and we're not worried that you might be mechata. We're not worried that by using the fire, you might come to be mechata b'gecholim. If you did what you were supposed to do on Erev Shabbos, so that the fire was kindled properly before Shabbos began, now go ahead, use the fire. You can't read by the fire. But you could use the light, you could walk around the house, you could look at something next to the fire, you could sit there and get nice and warm. Beinim hi al gabe karka. This is true if you're talking about a fire built on the ground, oy al gabe hamenorah, or if it's a torch that's built on some kind of candelabra. Va'afilu hi midvarim shein oisin mehen psilu l'Shabbos. And this is true even if the wicks that are burning on this madura are the type of wicks that we say you're not allowed to make a wick for Neresh Shabbos out of them because they don't burn well. What's the chiddush of the mechaber? The mechaber is telling you, even though you're using a material that we say you can't use for Neresh Shabbos because it doesn't burn well, so that means that you have l'chera, a madura that's not burning very well. So now there's room for a chash that you might want to go manipulate these wicks so that it should burn better. No, the halacha is you're allowed to use that fire. Why? Because it's a madura. Since it's a madura, that means it's a torch. You have a lot of wicks burning. So all the fire together, even inferior quality wicks, are going to make a good fire, and we're not chayshish that you might come to tweak them or manipulate them on Shabbos. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Vav. Ukeshahudlaka kashir. If you lit the fire properly before Shabbos, pirish miba'oid yom kaidam Shabbos. If you ignited the fire so that it was lit well enough before Shabbos, then ois katan zayin yachal lehischamem. You could sit by the fire and get warm, no problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hataz b'simen ayin reish hey, which is reish ayin hey, but that spells ra'ah, bad, so they switched it to ayin reish hey. Hataz b'simen ayin reish hey kosav, the Taz writes, even though the mechaber says over here that if you built a fire properly on Erev Shabbos with enough time before Shabbos, now the mechaber said you could sit by the fire and get warm. Nevertheless, says the Taz, to become okim, yesh li zar shelo leishev b'samuch. If you have an open fire, you should not sit too close to the fire, eitzel zanvois ha'udim, next to these little pieces of wood that are not really burning. So you know how it is. When you sit by a bonfire, if you remember your good old camp days, or if you sit by a fireplace and you watch the fire in a wood-burning fireplace, you have a nice fire burning, but there are zanvois. A zanov is a tail. You have little thin sticks of wood that are sticking out on the outer edges of the fire that are not burning. Those are udim. Hareze ud mutzal me'esh. You have something, a stick that's not, it's mutzal me'esh. It's not burning. It's not burning yet. Now, there's always that temptation. You see that stick sticking out of the fire, you might want to push it into the fire. Not because the fire is not burning well. The fire is burning beautifully. You have a beautiful fire. But you have a stick over here that's not burning. So there's a temptation. Push the stick in so it should burn. That's what the Taz is saying. The Taz is saying, the Mechaber says, that if you built your fire properly on Erev Shabbos, and you weren't over on Yisud Rabbanon, gesund heit, sit right next to the fire and get warm. Says the Taz, take it easy. Don't sit too close to the fire, because if you have those zanvois, you might be tempted to push them into the fire so that they should burn. Azoi zok the Taz. You might be tempted to go manipulate them to stick them into the fire. Aval, however, Das El Yarabba, it's the opinion of the El Yarabba. V'hatois Shabbos, the loy chayshidan lozeh. The El Yarabba says, the Tois Shabbos says, well, that we're not chayshish for this. Why not? So the El Yarabba says, the lashon of the El Yarabba is, v'nira la'anias daiti de'ein lachish l'chumra chadoshazu. We don't have to worry about this new chumrah that the Taz is talking about. Let's remember, we're talking about an Issur D'Rabbanan here. What Issur D'Rabbanan are we aware of? So we're aware of the Issur D'Rabbanans of Reish Nun Gimel and Reish Nun Daled, Shema Yechata B'Kachalim, by cooking food. This fear also, Shema Yechata, that you might go ahead to do something to kindle your fire if it wasn't built well before Shabbos, that's also in the Mishnah, in the Gemara in Shabbos. But we don't have anywhere in Shas and Poskim that says that when you have a fire that is ignited well and it's burning beautifully, that there's a chash that you might take the zanvois, you might take these pieces of wood that are not burning and push them into the fire. We never heard of such a chumrah. We never heard of such a gzeira. So what are you inventing Xeris? So the El Yerab is not maskim to this chumrah of the Taz, and therefore the El Yerab says, go ahead, use the fire, enjoy the fire, even very close to the bonfire or to the tanur. Unless you're engaged in something that needs careful attention. Likrois kenegda, or to read by the fire. I told you that when we read the Mechaber. Yes, you're allowed to use the light of the fire. You can enjoy the warmth of the fire, but you're not allowed to read a sefer by the fire. So no reading Tzena or Rena next to the fire. No being Mavisedra next to the fire. Because that's a Gzera that we're going to learn about later, that when you read, there's a concern that you might manipulate something to make more light. The same thing, something that's Tzarech Iyun Rav. Even if you're not reading, I don't know, if you're looking and you're trying to tell the difference between two things or whatever it is, trying to think of a good marshal in my head that comes out on Shabbos, you're checking your vegetables for bugs, So this is something that needs Iyun Rav that you can't do next to the fire, because again, then there would be Xera that you might tweak it to make more light. Because then we have a fear that you might manipulate the fire. You might manipulate something that's burning to make more light. Hey. Ois Katan Ches, the Mechaber said, you're allowed to enjoy this fire, even if the wicks or the woods that are burning are things that you're not allowed to use for Neiros Shabbos. Because by a bonfire or a big fire in an oven, since you have a nice big fire, each burning piece helps ignite the one next to it. So by Neiros Shabbos, where you have one wick, so there are inferior quality wicks we don't want you to use because they don't make a clean flame. They don't make a good, steady flame. But when you're talking about a torch or you're talking about a madura, even if the items that are burning are of inferior quality, where you have a nice built fire, each piece helps ignite the other one, and you're going to have a good, strong fire. We're not afraid you're going to come to manipulate it. Okay, Sif Beis, says the Mechaber. Yesh Oimrim, there are those that say, Shebepekechomin, when we're dealing with coals, so this is, you're not building a fire out of wood. You're building a fire out of coal. So by coals, says the Mechaber, there are those that say you don't need that the fire should take hold of the coals well. Even if you ignite just a little bit of the pile of coals, that is sufficient. Why? Because the fact, the metzius of the type of coals that they used was that as soon as you ignited a little bit of it, it took off and it ignited, so there was no room for a fear that you might come to stoke it or manipulate it in any way to help the fire grow. That was the nature. If you're burning something nowadays, you need to know the nature of what it is that you're burning. If it's something that, once you have a tiny bit lit, it just takes off, so then there would be no Xera. If it's something that does need work, then there would be a Xera. There's no Mishnah Berurah on Sif Beis, Sif Gimel. Madura shel zefes, if you have a bonfire that's made out of some kind of tar or pitch. Vishal gofris, again, gofris is sulfur. Vishal kash ugivava, or it's made out of straw and stubble. These are also items that ignite very quickly. And therefore, says the Mechaber, afilu lo yachas behema or elakoshahu, even if the fire only took hold of a little bit of the flammable material, shari, you could do that right before Shabbos and you could walk away from the fire again because there's no room for the Gzera. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Tesh shel zefes, ayin b'gemara, du adin shuman v'shaiva v'chol dever hanitach. When the Mechaber specifies zefes, pitch, tar, it also means some kind of a shuman, which is a grease, or vishava, or wax, v'chol davar hanitach, any other kind of flammable materials that melt. These are things that ignite very quickly and very well, and therefore there's no need for this gzera. So over here, the Mishnah Berurah defines for us, finally, he gives us the definition in his words of kash and givava. Says the Mishnah Berurah, kash, what's straw? Zanvei shibolim. These are the tails of the ears of grain. What does that mean? Well, picture wheat in your mind. So you have the stalk, and at the top of the stalk you have the actual ear of the grain, where all the grain is, the kernels of grain are in that top piece. But when you harvest your wheat, you don't just harvest the very top, you harvest the top with quite a bit of the stalk. So the stalk is called the tail of the ear of grain. That's the kash. That's what we're calling straw over here. Givava, what's givava, says the Mishnah Berurah? Shegoivin misada acharaketzira. So you went and you harvested your wheat, so you took the straw together with the top piece where the grain is. But then you left a certain amount of stubble that's still attached to the ground that you then need to gather off the ground. That's the givava. Says the Mishnah Berurah. So first says the Mechaber. So the Mechaber told us here, if you have a fire that's built of zephes, pitch, gofris, sulfur, kash, givava, so then afilu lo yachas behem ur l'kol shu shari, as long as it ignited a little bit before Shabbos, you're good, because the fire will take off and it won't need any additional manipulation, so there's no room for gzera. Says the Mechaber weiter, v'chein madura shel kanim v'shel gar'inei tamarim kishehem mifuzarim. So too, if you have a bonfire that's made out of kanim are reeds, dry reeds, v'shel gar'inei tamarim, or the seeds of dates, which apparently are flammable. Go no. So if you need fuel and you're out in the wild and you don't know what to use and you have date trees, you could use the seeds of dates. Kishehem mifuzarim, if they're loose and spread out. But if you're dealing with bundles of reeds, v'hagar'inim besal, or you're dealing with a basket of date seeds, then tzrichim cheyatzis behema or ad sheteah shaleves oila me'eleh. So the Mechaber says like this. First, he tells us about fuels that readily ignite, so there's no room for gzera, so you could build your fire, just ignite it a little bit and you're good. You could just ignite the pile a little bit right before Shabbos and you're okay. One of the things that the Mechaber says is, if you make a fire out of reeds or out of the seeds of dates, if they're mifuzarim, if they're loose, then you could just ignite it a little bit right before Shabbos and you're good. Why? Because the fire will travel through the pile, it will readily ignite, and you have no problems. But if it's combined, so you have a basket of date seeds, or you have a thick bundle of reeds, that won't catch well. And we understand why, because the air can't get in. So that's going to need manipulation and work to get it to light. Then there is room for gzera. Then the halacha would be that would have to be ignited to the extent of roiv, or hashalheves oila me'eleha, before Shabbos begins. Says the Mechaber, v'yesh oimrim behepech. However, this is a machlekes rishonim. The Rosh learns punkt fakert. The Rosh learns if the date seeds or the reeds are spread out, then you need ad shehashal heves yotzeh me'eleh. Why? Because the Rosh reasons if the fuel is spread out, then each date seed doesn't readily ignite from the next one. Each reed doesn't readily ignite from the one next to it because it's spread apart. So if it's spread apart, you would need roiv of the pile to ignite before Shabbos. You would need hashalheves oila me'eleh. But if it's combined, you don't, because it will ignite well. The other Rishonim, that would be the Rif, the Rambam, they learn the other way. They learn, like we said first, if it's a dense pile of date seeds, it doesn't catch well because there's no air. If it's bundles of reeds, it doesn't catch well, and then the gzera is that way. So here we have a machlekes rishonim. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut yud aleph kishem mifuzarim hatam. The reason for these rishonim that if they're mifuzarim, if they're spread out, there's no room for a gzera. Hatam the kevin she'achas behena or k'tzas b'oid yom, because once the pile ignites a little bit before Shabbos, shuv hem dolkin me'alein, the fire will take off on its own. Aval kishem agudos, but if it's bundles of reeds, oy besal, or it's date seeds in a basket, shuv ena shal heves yichol likanis ben, then the flame can't get in without help. V'hu dasa rif Rambam. V'dasa yeshayimim shu dasa rosh. The opinion of the yeshayimim here is the shitas rosh. V'hatur hu lahepach is punkt fakert. The kisheim b'fuzaros, if they're spread out, kalachas ben loy timtzes chaver tolavara, so then they won't catch one from the other. V'hem kavim v'holchim, so the fire will die out. Hilkach tzrichim roiv. So in that case, you would need roiv. You would need shaleves oila me'aleh before Shabbos, because otherwise we would have a gzera. Masha einken kisheim ne'agadim yachad. But if if they're bundled together, they'll catch from each other, v'chein begarinin, and so too by the date seeds. Thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. The schus of Liman HaTorah should be megan against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should send Yeshua's, Refuah's, Parnassas, Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the BS God Tzedek. B'mehera v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.